Zoom folks, nice to see you. Of course, Dan knows he doesn't exactly know what to expect when he gives me a microphone. So be a little prepared.
I do know, consistent with the theme of transparency that Carlos was saying about, we're very transparent. So
That's exactly what I was just thinking, Dan, because while I didn't expect to say the things I'm going to say now, part of them have been motivated by Carlo. And actually, in a way that, I saw earlier that both of our names were up here. I didn't expect it, but that there'd be a bit of I'll call it a debate of sorts. And I don't have any answers. I'm exceptionally experienced in real estate. I've spent my entire career in real estate. And again, our family's privileged and honored to support the Real Estate Institute at Notre Dame to bring different disciplines into the real estate industry. And then, of course, have an impact on the world. Notre Dame has a goal to have an impact on the world and a mission for good. And, whether it be in theology or philosophy or the arts. Obviously, this building is the home to many of the architecture students at Notre Dame, but also obviously one of the pillars that, the institute that Dan runs is, of course, church property. I have a couple of, vignettes that are going through my head, and I apologize that my wheels spin real fast. They don't always end up at a good place, but I was struck by a couple of things. One is that because I'm in the real estate business for my whole career, people randomly come up to me all the time and say, I'm thinking about buying a house. I was wondering if you could give me some advice, right? And even though I'm in the real estate business and in some respects, I cherish real estate, it's my vocation of sorts. I always say to them, don't buy the house. And they always look at me like, what are you, crazy? And they say, well, I don't want to pay rent. And I say, why? I said, you know what it costs to own a home? Do you know what it costs in roof repairs and gutter repairs and mowing the lawn? And I say, just rent. And they say, well, then I can't take the value of equity opportunities and things like that. And I'll say, well, they're not guaranteed, right? And it is an investment. Owning a home is a lifestyle decision. I was struck by that in the context of, the church and what Carlo mentioned. And I think that one of the things that when we talk about the church, because of its word, capital C and low c, right, lowercase c, is that when you say the word church, you get the connotation of real estate because of the church or a church, right? But we know, and what I was struck by in Carlos' discussion is that the church, capital C, is the people. It's not the buildings. And right now, even though I love real estate, my perspective as an American, not someone who lives here in Rome or in Vatican City, is the church is irresponsibly burdened by real estate. While I couldn't agree with Carlo more, we are obliged as the church to support the church and its mission and its assets. We're not obliged to support assets that are worthless to the mission of the church. And I think that I'm struck by the gospel reading when Jesus says, shake your sandals and shake your sand, and don't take your cloak, just go. Right. And that's what the apostles did. And that's what Jesus did. Jesus, you don't talk about where Jesus lived. He lived off the land. So many of our wonderful priests, I think the word is mercenary priests that, basically travel and don't have a parish, right? Or they don't have, they're the Dominicans or the Jesuits or the Oblates or the Redemptorists, whatever they all are. And I'm struck by the fact that we think the church too often is its real estate, and it's not. It's the Eucharist, right? It's the Eucharist, and it's the people. And think about all the resources we are using to maintain, and not only resources of dollars, but people's time. How much time is being spent in all of our parishes and all of our archdioceses, seminaries and schools around the world? The time and energy to mow the lawn and cut the grass and fix the roof on real estate, right? And I love real estate, but we have to stop making the church about its real estate.
So, Ward, let's get the debate going here.
Yeah.
I'll just play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
and Carlo can also jump in too.
Please.
So what do you say to the argument? And I think your focus on the Eucharist is great. The word monstrance came up, and I actually failed to mention that part of the Exeter logo, if you actually look on it, most people wouldn't know, but it's actually a monstrance, right? So the Eucharist is at the center, and the Eucharist is in the church. What do you say in terms of folks who have, I mean, even in Philadelphia, right? There's parishes that are closing, schools that are closing. Everybody who's invested so much time, money, effort, etc. How do you balance that in terms of, yeah, maybe the church is growing somewhere else and we need to jump. How do you balance those issues and the fact that the church may rise again someplace? There's an ebb and flow, like Carlo was saying.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's very clear. And again, I don't have any answers. I felt compelled sitting there to bring up the other side of the, protecting the iconic real estate and the historic real estate that is so vital. There's so much of it that's vital, but there's so much of it that's not, because it's not really historic. It's more like we become attached to it, right, as persons. And even, by the way, I mean, I'm looking at so many beautiful priests and out there and nuns, is that, they become drawn to their parish and their parish church. And I think that so many of those facilities that are not being used is because of the ebb and flow. I mean, I come from Philadelphia. Philadelphia is, one of the oldest archdioceses in the United States. It's one of the largest archdioceses in the United States. I think there's something like 350 parishes. Well, that was at a different time. That's not when we had cars. There's one on every third. Of course, that you're in Rome, but there's one on every other corner in Philadelphia. And that's because you had people, immigrants. The Italians came over, they built a church on First Street. The Germans came over, they built one on Second Street. The Polish came over, they built one on Third Street. And now they're not ethnic parishes. They were ethnic parishes
in the U.S. And we call that the parish proximity problem.
Yeah.
When we got to Italy, we realized, wow, there's a bigger basilica proximity problem in terms of a basilica every 10 feet.
Exactly. So I think that, Dan, I think that we have to acknowledge what is that history that we're holding on to. The way that the world operated, we are going to a virtual world. I mean, we were talking about it in the courtyard. One of the more prominent websites or apps in the States right now is called Halo. If you've not heard of it, it's a great evangelization application for people to enhance their prayer life and enhance their interaction with other Catholics to support each other's. But it's virtual, right? And we don't need a church on every corner. And I think that's we have to come to grips as a community with this aspect. Now, again, what I would say, that having been said, I also don't disagree with what Carlo and the church have to say about how we're obliged to support the church and how we have to be responsible as we transform from point A to point B. And Dan, I think to your point, I mean, if there's a time again, which would be beautiful, when we have churches filled and we can't have capacity, and in some archdioceses, Dallas, Bishop Burns is building churches like crazy down in Dallas, Texas. In the United States. And even though the church obviously is in decline in the United States and secularism is everywhere. But that having been said, that is what these resources that Carlo, that's what we're obliged to fund, right? We're obliged to fund, everybody in the United States should build the next church in Dallas because every church that's in Dallas is full, right? Is we're not obliged as parishioners, et cetera, to, in my, again, humble assessment, to take care of property that is not serving the mission of the people and of the Eucharist and of the church.
Ward, how does the 99-year ground leases and other, because Cardinal Pell actually talked about that in his first, maybe this dovetails with the Philly project or others.
It's going to go.
How does that fit in? Because that's almost a middle ground of not selling it, at least for some properties.
Yep.
Keeping it because who knows what will happen in 99 years, but also getting either a cash flow like Father Mike talked about in his talk, cash flow, revenue stream, some kind of way or a social mission of, the city could be served by leasing it to somebody.
Right. So again, as I transition from some of my initial broader thoughts to some of the more practical things that we've been involved in, is that I was asked a bunch of years ago, I don't know, decade and a half ago or so to help Archbishop Chaput, who was in Denver and ended up in Philadelphia, to be on a real estate committee. Again, Philadelphia has a lot of unused or surplus church property, shutting high schools, shutting colleges. I'm sorry, well, some colleges, not many, high schools, grade schools, seminaries, rectories, convents, unfortunately, right? And so I got to see a wide variety of some of the things that Cardinal Pell and Dan are alluding to. I've done projects in Philadelphia. First, I was on this board in committee and worked with the CFO in the archdiocese and the archbishop, and with another group, with groups of people, to come up with solutions. The diversity of property was actually quite large, as you might expect. But since then, I actually left the committee because I thought I could do the archdiocese greater benefit, and some of those things even show up, as I stand here, hopefully, in trying to help come to solutions and think through how you what you do with this unused real estate. So in Philadelphia, I've done projects with schools, I've done projects with the seminary, I've done projects with parishes, and I've done with what I'll call the Cathedral Basilica, the heart of the arch, right? Which in Philadelphia we call 222. And so I can take you through again briefly some of those examples. But the thing about real estate is, of course, we know it's ubiquitous. The church's real estate is ubiquitous; it's everywhere. And the problem is that and appropriately, the world's flat, so to speak, and it's very decentralized. So the thing that I would say, like, if there's a principle, there's a handful of best practices that DJ and Maddie and the rest of the church properties group at Notre Dame are working on, is first off, I think about, if you have a property, is how local is your property, how regional is your property, how national is your property, or how international is your property? And I'll get into some of those components. And a lot of that goes to what I'll call the highest and best use of property. And unlike, maybe, I don't know who makes this tie. I got this one in Naples, actually, Italy. But so it's not, but if it was a Brooks Brothers tie from the United States, they put them on the mill and they make 100,000 of them. They sell them all over. You get a General Motors, a car, and they're coming off the line. There's 100,000, and they're all the same. There's no one piece of real estate that is the same in the entire world. None. Buildings look the same. Buildings can be painted the same color. They can have the same design. They can have the same architect, but they all sit on a different piece of land. The terra, right, that they're on, the firma, right, is unique in every situation. So coming up with generalizations about how you deal with church property is really, really hard, because it's very, very unique. And one of the challenges that the church has, and that we all have in trying to benefit and have positive outcomes, is the fact that we'd love to come up with best practices. We'd love to come up with things that could be shared amongst groups like this, and we can, but you never know exactly what applies in each situation. Now, so as an example, what you'll see in some of these situations is, as Dan said, is what is the long-term prognosis for a piece of property? And should we do, as an example, a 99-year ground lease? And of course, the answer is it depends, right? How critical is that property? And I would say, again, just as what I'd call a less serious layperson than any true ministers of the church, with many of you are, both literally and figuratively, I would say no, don't do 99-year ground leases. The only reason to do a 99-year ground lease is if you believe that if you give a lump sum, the bishop or the pastor or the people will throw it away foolishly, and you can't manage money. If you can't manage money, if you don't have trust or belief in either transparency or trust in the entity that will receive the capital, then you have to do a ground lease. Not because it's the best alternative, because actually it's probably the worst alternative in most cases. Everyone believes it sounds like a good idea, but I believe it's a terrible idea. And the reason why is that people who have capital and people who covet property do not want to participate in a ground lease. There's risk involved in the ground lease, right? And 100 years is a long time. And everyone says, yeah, but the church is going to be around for another 1,000 years, not 100 years. And the answer is yes, but there's not clear that they need this property for another week, right? And it's not clear when they will need it again. And if the church has a need, then we will be obliged to support that need with our capital to rebuild it or rebuy it and go buy something next door. So I don't really believe personally in the 99-year ground lease. Parishes, archdioceses all over the country and all over the world will leave significant amounts of money that can be used to build the faith, to evangelize, to feed the homeless, and those types of things will get wasted because of someone coveting something that shouldn't be coveted. I mean, that's really what's going on in a lot of these situations. Is there's pastors and bishops that are coveting some tangible asset, and they're not willing to let it go, and they use the 99-year ground lease as a crutch. Is my perspective.
So we'll get some questions in. One thing that would I think be interesting, and you don't need to respond to this because we'll go to Clint next. But so it sounds like you're not a fan of the 99-year ground lease in most circumstances, although maybe they should have done the Archdiocese of Chicago as opposed to give that money away, because then it just evaporated. Right?
Exactly. So, right.
But it might be interesting to think, and I don't know if anybody does this in Philadelphia or otherwise, like our diocese and archdiocese thinking, okay, what are sort of our core properties that like we would like St. Peter's Basilica? Okay, we're never selling that, right? Obviously, like what are the core properties? And most of them would fall in that category. What are the ones it might not even be sort of a church property. It might be a donated house that someone, a parishioner donated, and it doesn't make sense for the church to own this random house. And then what are the ones that are going between? I don't know if that happens on a systematic basis in most places, but it probably should.
There's no doubt. I'm sorry. Do you have a question too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Clint Weber. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, and I work for the bishop there. One of the things that we do is asset allocation. In the point that you made, which with respect to the 99-year ground lease, the risk associated with that amount of time, it's hard to argue that point. Is it possible as an allocator for me, however, to view real estate, potentially cash flowing real estate with all of its known risks that exist, and properties that are not in direct support of the mission, to invest in those cash flowing real estate properties as a form of long-term investment and yield when considered against some other traditional asset classes that are not performing very well? For example, corporate bonds that are yielding 2.25%. I might want to enter into a 99-year ground lease, considering all the risks of the time, to achieve a higher yield with a real asset, as opposed to a lower yield with a financial asset. So thinking maybe about just the diversification into real estate as a viable asset class, as opposed to just receiving cash. Cash is good to have sometimes, but as an allocator, especially in the United States right now with an inflation at 8%, cash is not a good asset class to have. And I could argue that potentially investing in the stock market isn't either. So just potentially your thoughts on real estate as an asset class for both yield and then over time appreciation.
Okay. Obviously that question is, a standard deviation different than we're talking about. I happen, because of the way that I operate in the real estate business, I have very keen insights as to the way that the world's pensions, foundations, sovereign wealths, endowments like Notre Dame is, and the part of my answer be called Scott Malpass, the ex-CIO at Notre Dame. But when you think about asset allocation, and by the way, I also want to just clarify that when I talked about taking a lump sum in cash, I wasn't suggesting keeping it in cash. What I was suggesting is that if you believe you're going to be irresponsible with that lump sum, either in spending it or investing it poorly, then obviously maybe you should do a 99-year ground lease with your piece of property if you're a pastor or a bishop. I think relative to your question too, there's very few archdioceses around the world seemingly that have massive surpluses of capital from which they have an asset allocation plan. But to answer your question, the way that I would think through the answer is you should be asset allocating the way that the top endowments, the top foundations, and the top pensions of the world allocate capital. I don't think you should be trying to guess, is it a good time to be in the stock market, or is it a good time to be in bonds, or is it a good time to be in real estate? Most asset allocations have about 10 to 14% in real estate. So you should probably have 10 to 14% in real estate. And then you say, if you're going to have that asset class, and by the way, those people that have increased it from 10 to 14%, most of them have increased it because they're replacing fixed income securities that are yielding very low amounts. And they're using real estate as a proxy for fixed income because it's a tangible asset and the like, and its yield components. But if you chose to do that, I'd certainly say if somebody said, I want to be at the higher end for that reason, I think it'd be a credible case to make. I think the thing relative to if you own a piece of property and you want to make that part of your portfolio, then the problem I have with it is concentration risk, because you're betting on that piece of land and that building at that proper time to be the right piece of your real estate 10 to 14%. And I'd rather see you sell that property if you thought it was surplus and put it into a diversified 10 to 14% real estate play, not a specific one. So that's the way I'd think through that. To answer Dan's question, I think that, of course, there's not enough archdioceses around the world thinking through strategic plans about what are the most strategic assets. I will say that while Philadelphia made a lot of mistakes along the way, I think they did a pretty good job of that. And when they thought through, one of the things that they sold was in Philadelphia, we had a lot of cemeteries that the archdiocese owned for Catholic burials. But they realized that, and Philadelphia used to, a lot of people don't know this, but as the size of cities in the United States, it used to be New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia. It used to be the fourth largest city in the United States. It is no longer. It's about the seventh or eighth biggest city now, because a lot of people move into Phoenix and Dallas and Fort Worth. But what they decided was, we have enough cemetery land that we will never have enough people die in this city ever again, probably, to use the cemetery land. And so that wasn't a strategic piece. The piece which, why don't you bring it up, DJ, if you can? I'll just say that is a strategic piece, is a piece of property directly adjacent to the basilica. Okay. Now I'm going to twist a little bit my statement. And again, I don't want to speak with forked tongue, but what we did here is, can you do the Google Earth thing? I'm sorry, the satellite version here. This is the Cathedral in Philadelphia, and basically, is that it? Is that it right there with where the dot is? Okay. Okay. So basically, if I can, real quick, this is the cathedral. This is what they call the 222. This is the archdiocese headquarters. This was a fallow piece of property, and then this is a parking lot right here. And so what our organization did in trying to help the archdiocese is we suggested that there was surplus property that they could use for capital. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia needs capital badly for lots of reasons, including the scandal. And effectively, what we did is we did a ground lease that was 99 years because it was next to the basilica. But what we did was we agreed to give them a lump sum payment of $20 million and then $1 a year so they could get the capital. As opposed to thinking through a concept, if you said the value of the land was $20 million and a fair yield to pay was 5%. So instead of paying, what is that? It's $100,000. I think it's $100,000, or is it $1 million? Instead of paying $1 million a year for the property, 5% on 20 million, we agreed to pay them the 20 million up front, all at one time. And so that also is if you do find a property like this, which sits right next to the basilica, so it's clearly long-term strategic to the archdiocese, certainly a piece of property, I would argue fairly, that I think that the committee and the archbishop made a very good decision on. But again, you can still get all your money, right? Which is another thing. But I will say, if in this particular case, this was not a piece of property, which again, I can speak to another piece of property up the street next to St. Agatha's and St. James. So this was an archdiocesan property. We built a building on it, which is a 23-story apartment building, and it's just a commercial building. But the thing about it, when I talk about, when I mentioned earlier about the concept, is your property local, regional, national, or international? Okay. What a lot of that has to do with is what can be done with the property, and what is the cost of capital that you can inure to the benefit of your archdiocese and your property. Now, it's a complicated expression. It is not a complicated concept. The concept is you have a piece of property here, which is in the center of Philadelphia, one of the biggest cities in the United States. It is clearly has international capabilities. It's an urban downtown. Again, Europe pretty much only has downtowns. And in the United States, as many people know, suburbia is a prominent thing. But because this is an East Coast city, densely populated, and has great prominence, this is an international site. Now, what does that mean? That means that I can get the lowest cost of capital in the world. Where's the lowest cost of capital? Right now in the United States, I think the 10-year Treasury is trading about 3%, plus or minus. It was when I left. In Japan, interest rates are zero or negative. Okay. In Europe, interest rates are exceptionally low, barely above zero, although they're rising a bit at the moment, right? If you go into Korea right now, interest rates are near zero. If you go to Canada right now, interest rates are really low. So what we were able to do as a company, Exeter, in an EQT Exeter now, in benefit to the church, is that they hired a local broker. Everybody hires a local broker. Real estate's local. But how do you get the proper exposure for your property, the proper up to the right capital? Okay. If this was a property that was a property that you could build a couple of houses on, it wouldn't have international acclaim. We're building a building that's a $250 million building. So if it's a $250 million project, you can attract $250 million. People from Korea and Japan and Canada will compete with that property. If it's a $10 million property, they don't have time to do that. Okay. So what we were able to do is bring in this particular case, a Canadian pension plan, which is called Cathedral, which is part of the British Columbia Investment Corporation in Canada. It's their pension for the people that live in the British Columbia province of Canada. Their pension has a really, really low cost of capital, right? So they're trying to get a low yield. And if you're selling your property or transacting with organizations that have very low costs of capital, you get significantly greater amount of remuneration for your property. And so you need what's going on. And I've seen this happen in many cases. You know, there's a place right down the street, St. Agatha, St. James. Okay. So St. Agatha, St. James, this is in West Philadelphia. This is only 2 miles from the other site. This happens to be a local parish. And they had the Newman Center. You can see the Penn Catholic and Drexel Catholic Newman Centers, which is the student. There are, of course, 2 non-Catholic universities in the city of Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. I think you said you went there, or your husband went there? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I went to the MBA at the Wharton School of Business, which is right. The Wharton School of Business is right like here at Huntsman Hall. Yeah, right there, Huntsman Hall. So we're only 2 blocks away, right? And so that's the Newman Centers used for Catholic education and support of the Catholic community within the non-Catholic universities. So they had extra land there, and the parish had extra land, and so we did agree to sell it. Now, what happened was the local brokerage firm, it happened to be in this case CB Richard Ellis, but it could have been Cushman & Wakefield or Savills or BNP Paribas, or it could have been whomever, Colliers. What they did is they're local brokers, so they marketed it. They thought they were doing a very good job, and the highest bid they got was $12 million for the property. And I'm in the real estate business. That's what I do for a living. I'm like, that is crazy. It is worth significantly more. I watched who the winning bidders were. I watched who got exposed to it, and I said, this is not a local property. This is a international property. And so I asked the Archbishop if he would give me 90 days to get him a better offer on it. Okay. And I got the government of Singapore to pay $20 million for the piece of property. And they went on to build also a similarly sized, slightly larger than the one I just referred to, apartment building that services the University of Pennsylvania's students. It's a student housing type project for about $250 million, which is scalable for them. But they were able to pay, 60% more, 70% more, 75% more, I guess, than the other bidders, because their cost of capital is near nothing. And for them to get a 3% yield was sufficient, whereas we might not buy a piece of property unless we get a 6% return or a 7% return. That's good.
Sorry, I agree with you because I work outside of Philadelphia. I worked in King of Prussia with the Holy Donut. If you know the American Baptist churches, I helped them dispose of their 25 of their 50 acres. They initially thought to do a ground lease, but you also get a 15-20% discount.
Yeah.
Even if you capitalize that lease, you still only get a portion of the money.
Agreed.
But what I find with a lot of churches is particularly, let's say, Black churches in inner cities, there's a legacy play because they have to go back to their congregations and say, I didn't sell a piece of dirt. They have some historical reasons, which are not, financial, but they have a feeling about holding on to the land. And I find with a lot of churches, this is an issue with the disposition, because to your point, a 99-year ground lease is really a crutch. It's saying, I kept the land, I didn't sell it, I actually got some money. But you're right, even with that money, you're probably not going to invest it very well. It'll evaporate, and now your property's locked up. So I agree with you. I just don't know, though, how you change that point of view when people have more of an emotional hold than a financial hold on that kind of property.
You have to make it the 11th commandment. The church shall not covet its goods and its buildings.
Yeah. And it's right, and it's absolutely not working for you, because when we disposed of the Holy Donut, they were able to right size the congregation, buy a much smaller building, retrofit it, and they had another $20 million that they could use for actual church issues. So I actually agree with you, but it's very difficult.
Yeah, agreed. The last one I'll just mention real quick was, I'll mention two. One is another one that this is at 36th and Walnut, 38th and Walnut. There's one up at 48th, which is a school called West Catholic High School. It's a Christian Brothers High School in Philadelphia, and it's actually in an all Black community. It's an all, 99% or so Black enrollment. Also, again, with economic challenges of the church. But again, so what we were able to do is help consult them. And because of where it sits in the United States, it wasn't the scale of the project was not going to be large enough, first off, to get capital from Singapore or Canada or Korea or Europe. German obviously also has low cost of capital. But what we were able to do is we were able to get it designated locally. And this goes to Carla with the local congressmen and federal officials to get it included in what was referred to when President Trump was in office, an opportunity zone. And so by doing that, it allowed for tax benefits for high net worth individuals in the United States. So you have a high net worth individual that if you get it put in an opportunity zone, they get tax benefits for buying that property. So the way that we capitalized that property, again, it was a situation where in the community, the top bid was $6 million or $8 million. By getting it put into an opportunity zone, the school was able to get $12 million for the property. And again, they're not only building housing there, but there'll also be some affordable and essential housing, which is, I know, something that Carlo was also referring to in his comments is that, housing that fits the needs of the community as well at the same time. So I think one of the things, and again, it's a slightly complicated concept, but not really, is try to figure out what the proper capital is, not who's the best buyer, but what's the type of capital that is best suited to serve the highest valuation for your property.
What's your Ian Starr from Oakland, California? What's your view on if you're not selling a property, you're not disposing of it, you have a parish congregation operating in there, but it's declining. What are your thoughts on how to rethink the use of that space? Maybe it's putting in a cafe for the community that serves the church too, or some other kind of activities that would allow that to be a viable space with church use.
Yeah. So, and this goes a little bit to Carlos' comments too, is that, using church property for multiple uses and those types of things. I'd say the biggest mistake I think first off, that decision will be made locally, first off. I think the biggest problems that you have, and this is one of the reasons that the Real Estate Institute, was kind of conceived at Notre Dame. It is that it has to be about the demand. You have too many owners of real estate. You have too many municipalities, mayors, congressmen, whatever they are, who say, I want this in my town. I want this in my district. I want this in my community. And they have no sense of what the demand will be for it. One of my favorite things is because I do business. We have 55 offices around the world. Is to go into a community and have the head of the economic development say, we want this to be a tech hub. I'm like, you don't live in Northern California. I'm sorry, it won't ever be a tech hub, ever. Right. And they look at me like, oh, no, we don't want warehouses here, even though they have farm fields and highway systems as far as they can see. And Amazon's lining up at the door to lease 3 million square feet because they want better employment. Well, they're not going to ever get Cisco systems to move to Des Moines, Iowa. It's just not going to happen, right? So I think the first thing is to get get development minds on it, not wishes and the development minds that are focused on where will the demand come for this type of product. The other ones, by the way, without any disrespect to those who might in the room participate in this stuff, is the other last people to ask are architects. Everybody hires an architect and a designer to reconceive their space. They don't know anything about demand in the marketplace for real estate. They know how to make spaces beautiful. They know how to be efficient with them. They know how to make them maybe use the right materials for sustainability and recyclability. And that's beautiful, beautiful skill. They're great at drawing, right? They make straight lines. I only draw crooked lines. But effectively, they're the worst people to try to tell you how to use your real estate for its highest and best use. So focus on demand would be my answer to you.
Great. Well, God draws straight even with crooked lines, Ward. So we really appreciate you being here.